for joining us today on Capitol Outlook.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. John Lott, author of the book More Guns and Less Crime, testified before the Senate Education Committee earlier this week. His testimony was riveting, and Capitol Outlook wanted to learn more. We caught up with Dr. Lott following his appearance before the Senate Education Committee. Dr. John Lott now joins us on the Capitol Outlook set. Dr. Lott testified Wednesday relative to House Bill 114, whether or not gun-free zones should be repealed in the state of Wyoming. Dr. Lott, welcome to Capitol Outlook.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Dr. Lott, you were the less emotional, I think, person involved in the testimony today. You had a lot of statistics, author of a book, More Guns, Less Crime. Recount for us a little bit your testimony and why you were here testifying before the House Education Committee.
Right. Well, I mean, I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at a range of different universities. And the way I came to this issue was kind of through research that I had done. I had been chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And, you know, to me, I think what ultimately drives most people on these issues is what impact these different rules are going to have on safety. You know, what's going to save or cost the most lives. I'm not that interested in arguing constitutional issues and other things that came up during the thing. I mean, I can understand people care about those things, but to me, it's basically just an issue of safety.
Dr. Lott, you were talking about statistics that say that guns essentially make places less likely to have mass shootings. Talk about the statistics you relayed to the committee.
Right. Well, I think just kind of one thing that startles me is if you look at all the public mass shootings since 1950, with just two exceptions, they've all taken place where guns are not allowed for general citizens to have. And, you know, Wyoming, for example, if you have a concealed carry permit, you can carry it virtually any place in the state. That's true in most right-to-carry states. If these types of attacks were random, you would think that 98, 99% of the attacks would take place where people are allowed to carry guns. Instead, they keep on attack occurring in those tiny areas within the states, these right-to-carry states, where people aren't allowed to carry. And what you find is that very frequently these killers consciously discuss or talk or think about whether or not their victims are going to be able to go and defend themselves. I mean, you just take a couple cases from within the last year that people probably know about. The Santa Barbara killing last June, which got a lot of attention. If you actually read the 141-page manifesto that the killer had there, you know, after you get by the parts where he's complaining that women don't appreciate what a great guy he is and, you know, he doesn't understand why people aren't his friends, he spends a lot of detail there planning his attack. And he goes through multiple situations. He says one thing, for example, he says Santa Barbara, which is where he was, is spring break mecca for California students and indeed students from across the West. And he thought that would be a perfect place where all of his ideal victims would be gathered kind of en masse at one time. But he pointed out, he looked at old YouTube videos. I mean, these guys study these things in amazing detail sometimes. And he found that there's just lots of police around. And he said maybe he could go and kill a couple of the police. But there were so many of them around there that there's no way he could kill enough of them before they killed him, before he could even go and start to go and kill the students that he wanted, which were his targets. You look at the, also in June last year, the mass shooting in Canada, the Moncton, New Brunswick killer. If you went to his Facebook page, he had like 12 comics on his Facebook page dealing with gun-free zones. One of the more amazing comics that he had there was a mass shooter in public. He had one of the victims was stumbling, running away from the guy, and as the victim was running away, he turned to him, he says, "You can't have a gun here, guns are banned. You know, you're not supposed to be able to go and shoot people." And the guy has a little bubble above his head thinking what a moron, as he's about ready to go and shoot that person too. So I'm just saying this is evidence that this guy was thinking about where to go and do these attacks. And what you find is these guys are obsessed with trying to kill as many people as they can because they want to get news attention. They want to commit suicide in a way that's going to have people talk about them. You know, they feel the world hasn't been fair to them or whatever. They've decided that they're going to commit suicide, but they want to go out with a bang, having people recognize who they were. And so, you know, you take something like the Newtown killer. You know, here's a guy who did essentially a dissertation on mass shootings. He had put together a 7.5 by 4, just one part of what he did. He put together a 7.5 by 4-foot Excel spreadsheet where he went through past mass shootings in the United States and around the world, showing the number of people killed or injured, the amount of news coverage, and graphed it out, showing the relationship as you killed more people, you got more news coverage. And so, he was comparing himself. He wanted to kill more people than the Norway killer, who holds the record for the most people killed or injured in a shooting attack, because he wanted to get more media attention than that guy had gotten worldwide.
Curious as to whether your research came upon any instances that were less planned, that were still shootings at schools, perhaps not mass shootings at schools, where that were gun-free zones that weren't planned in such detail, that might have been an emotional reaction to a teacher, to an athletic event. In shootings in those veins.
Right. Well, I mean, I basically have looked at all the cases where 2 or more people are killed. So there could be cases where one person's been killed or something like that. I haven't gone into that as much detail. But if you look at the cases where 2 or more people, and I'm accepting gang shootings, okay? I'm not including gang shootings in this. But if you look at cases where 2 or more people have been killed, accepting gang shootings, it's amazing how consistently these guys go and plan these things in advance. 6 months is like a short amount of time for these guys to go and plan. The Newtown guys spent 2.5 years. The guy that we were talking about at Santa Barbara, he spent almost 2 years. I mean, the 141-page manifesto was written almost over 2 years. You have just time after time. The Batman shooter, that's one of the short ones. We know he started ordering equipment that he used in the attack about 5.5 months before the attack occurred. We don't know how much further in advance he started thinking about doing this type of thing. But, it's when you have people spend this much time trying to think about these types of things, it just makes you realize how difficult it is to go and stop them from doing these attacks.
That said, we heard testimony in committee from the State School Boards Association, from the Community College Commission, from the University of Wyoming.
Right.
You asked legislators, and no college presidents have called and said support this. No school administrators have called and support this. Why is that? With the research, as you say that it is, that in fact your claim might be their schools would be safer. Why is that supports them?
I understand what the reaction is. I've been an academic almost all my life. And look, the natural reaction a lot of people have is they say, well, if I just ban guns from an area, it'll make it safer. But the problem you have to ask yourself, and I don't think it's always thought through completely, is who's more likely to obey these laws? One of the things I talked about in the hearing was, if you look at Ron Noble, and people can Google him and look at the statements that he said in 2013 after the Westland Mall attack in Kenya. Here you have a guy who's essentially heading up Europe's version of the FBI. And he said, when he first became head of Interpol, his notion was you simply banned guns in an area and you secured it, and that was the way to make it safer. But what he's learned over time is it's basically impossible, particularly when you're talking about terrorist attacks, to prevent these guys from being able to get guns into a mall or to some other type of area. And the problem is that it's the law-abiding good citizens who obey these rules, not the people who are doing these attacks. And rather than making it safer for the victims, you unintentionally make it safer for the people who are engaged in the attacks. And so what Ron Noble says, you have 2 options. You can either go for this gun-free zone type approach, or you can let individuals go and be able to defend themselves. And he says, over time, given that he's come to convince himself that it's just impossible, literally, whether it's going to be a school or a mall. I mean, if you have somebody planning something 6 months in advance, or even 3 months, you don't think they're going to figure out some way to get a gun in there? And the thing is, people often talk, even the NRA will talk about putting armed guards at schools and things like that. Armed guards have a very difficult job. I mean, first of all, it's an incredibly boring job. You're there day after day, week after week, month after month. And the thing is, you're in uniform. And so terrorists or these killers have huge strategic advantages. They can go and they decide where and when the attack's going to occur. It's hard for somebody to be on guard day after day, month after month there. Plus, they're in uniform. So what that means is the killers have a couple options. They can kill the armed person first, who's in uniform, or they can wait till they leave and then go and engage in the attack, or they can go to another target. And so, you know, the benefit of having concealed carry in these areas is that even if they've killed the law enforcement guy or he's left, they still don't know who next they have to take care of.
Dr. Lott, I'm curious, generally across the country, do law enforcement officials support the position? Do you believe in gun-free zones like schools,
right,
where teachers or administrators or others?
That's an excellent question.
Would they be supported?
Yeah. Well, there are lots of surveys of police. The largest one is done by an organization called Police One, which is the largest organization of police in the country. There are about 450,000 members. 380,000 of those are active full-time law enforcement. The other 70,000 are retired. Just to give you an idea, there's 560,000 full-time active duty law enforcement in the country. So it's a huge percentage of the total. They surveyed their members in 2013, and 91% of their members supported concealed carry very liberally. They just thought just background checks, that's it, in order to be able to go and get a permit. They didn't even require any training. When asked about mass shootings, which is what you're asking about specifically, 80% thought that the presence of concealed carry holders would reduce carnage in these areas. And that when asked what the top of a list of things, what was the number one thing the police officers supported to reduce mass shooting, the number one thing was to end gun-free zones.
We'll leave it right there. Dr. John Lott, thank you
you
very much for joining us on Capitol Outlook.
No, thanks for having me on.